The first time Andrew Archer said goodbye to Birdie Turner, she was 17 years old and standing in the yellow dust of Caldwell, Kansas, with her father's hand pressed firm against her shoulder as if he feared she might run after the stagecoach. She did not run, but she watched it go until the wheels and the horses and the silhouette of the only boy she had ever loved disappeared into the wide brown horizon, and she stood there long after the dust had settled, blinking against the sting of it with dry eyes, because she had used every last tear she owned the night before when Andrew had told her he was going north to Wyoming territory to make something of himself before he could ask her father for anything proper. That was 1878. She turned 18 that autumn, and 19 the autumn after, and by the time she was 20 she had stopped counting the years and started counting the small wounds of ordinary life instead. Her father's lungs gave out in the winter of 1880. Her mother had gone long before that, taken by a fever when Birdie was barely old enough to remember the particular softness of a mother's voice. After her father was buried in the hard Caldwell soil, Birdie packed what remained of the Turner household into a wagon and accepted the offer of her father's old friend, a cattle rancher named Gerald Holt, who ran a modest spread outside of Abilene and needed a woman who could cook and keep a house and not complain about the wind. She was not happy in Abilene, but she was not miserable either, and she told herself that was enough. She cooked for Gerald and his 2 ranch hands, she kept the house clean, she mended saddles and read whatever books she could find, and she wrote letters to no one because there was no one left who cared to hear from her. She did not write to Andrew Archer. She had no address for him. She had only the memory of his face and the particular way he had held her hand that last evening in Caldwell, as if he were memorizing the weight of it. Gerald Holt was a decent man, she supposed. He was 44 to her 20, and he never raised his voice at her, which she understood was not a small thing in those days. But he smelled of tobacco and cattle and something sour she could never quite identify, and when he asked her to marry him in the spring of 1881, she looked at the flat Kansas plain stretching out in every direction and thought that the horizon had never looked so much like a wall. She said yes anyway. There was nothing else to say yes to. They were married by a circuit preacher on a Thursday morning, and by Friday she had already understood that being Mrs. Gerald Holt was going to be a particular kind of loneliness with a ring around it. Gerald was not cruel. He was simply absent in all the ways that mattered, occupied entirely by cattle prices and water rights and the slow, serious business of a man who had already used up his feelings somewhere back in his younger years and had nothing left over for sentiment. He did not ask her about her days. He did not notice when she had been crying. He ate his supper and went to bed and rose before dawn, and the whole cycle repeated itself with the grinding regularity of a millstone. She endured it. That was the word she used in the private account she kept in her own head. She endured. And then one afternoon in late September of 1882, when the cottonwood trees along the creek bed had gone the color of hammered gold and the air carried the first real bite of autumn, a rider came up the long dirt road to the Holt Ranch, and Birdie was standing on the porch with a dishcloth in her hands when she recognized him. She recognized the set of his shoulders first, then the angle of his hat, and then the way he sat a horse as if he had been born in the saddle rather than placed there, easy and certain and belonging completely to the animal beneath him. She gripped the porch railing with one hand and pressed the dishcloth against her sternum with the other, as if she could muffle whatever her heart was trying to do. Andrew Archer. He had grown. That was her first coherent thought. He had been lean and boyish at 19 when she last saw him, and now he was a man of 23 with broad shoulders and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock country he had spent 4 years riding through. He wore a dark blue shirt and his boots were worn at the heel, and there was a scar she did not recognize along his left jaw, pale against his tanned skin. He pulled up at the fence and took off his hat and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she looked back at him, and the 4 years between them compressed into something small and dense and unbearable. Birdie, he said, just her name, like he had been practicing it or like he had not let himself say it in a very long time. Andrew, she said back, and her voice came out steadier than she deserved. He swung down from his horse and came to the fence, and she came down the porch steps and they met at the gate, 3 feet of weathered wood between them, and she thought she had never in her life felt a distance so clearly as she felt those 3 feet. "I came looking for you in Caldwell," he said. "Folks there told me your father passed. I am sorry, Birdie, truly." "Thank you," she said. "It was a hard winter. They told me you came to Abilene, told me you were keeping house for Gerald Holt." He paused, and she watched his eyes move to the ring on her left hand, and she watched something happen in his face that he immediately locked down behind a careful expression. "Then someone in town told me you married him." "I did," she said. He looked at the ring for one more moment, and then he looked at her face, and she made herself hold his gaze even though it cost her more than she had expected to pay on a Thursday afternoon. "I should have come sooner," he said quietly. "I should not have waited as long as I did. You said you needed to make something of yourself first. I know what I said." "Did you?" she asked, and she heard the thing in her own voice that she had not meant to let out, the small stripped hurt of it. "Make something of yourself." He looked down at his hat, turning the brim in his hands. "I got a piece of land up in Wyoming territory, about 400 acres along the Powder River. Good grass, good water. I built a house on it, small but sound." He paused. "I was coming back to ask you something. I had the whole speech ready, had it ready since last spring if you want the truth." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then she opened them. "Andrew, I know," he said. "I know, Birdie, I am not here to make trouble. I am not that kind of man, and you know it. I just needed you to know that I came back. I needed you to know it was real, all of it." She nodded. Her throat was too full to speak. "I will go now," he said. He put his hat back on and looked at her one last time. That careful lockdown look that she understood was the only way he knew how to protect himself in that moment. "You take care of yourself. You hear me?" "I hear you," she managed. He turned and walked back to his horse and swung up and rode out the way he had come, and Birdie stood at the gate and watched him go, and this time she was not 17 anymore, and she could not tell herself it would be all right the way she once could, because she was old enough now to know better. This was the second goodbye, and it was worse than the first because this time she understood fully what she was watching leave. She went inside and she cooked Gerald's supper, and she did not cry. She had used up all her tears on the first one. Gerald Holt died in the autumn of 1883. It was not a violent or dramatic death. It was a quiet one, the kind the West handed out with more frequency than any other kind. He had a pain in his chest for 2 weeks that he refused to let Birdie send for the doctor about, and one morning she came down to find him already gone, seated at the kitchen table with his coffee cup still warm, as if death had come and gone like a polite caller while she was sleeping. She buried him beside the 2 ranch hands she had cooked for who had died over the years, in the small fenced plot behind the barn, and she said what words she knew to say, and then she stood in the kitchen of a house that did not belong to her, and understood that she had $32 to her name and absolutely nowhere to go. The ranch went to Gerald's brother in Missouri, which she had known would happen. She had 2 weeks to clear out her belongings and decide on a direction. She sat with it for a week. She wrote no letters. She asked no one for help. And then on the 8th day she sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote one letter to the land office in Johnson County, Wyoming Territory, asking if they could direct a letter to a Mr. Andrew Archer, who she understood held land along the Powder River. It took 3 weeks for the letter to find him. It took another 2 weeks for his response to find her. By then she had moved into a boarding house in Abilene, paying her way by taking in mending work from the other boarders, her $32 stretched thin as paper. His letter was not long. Andrew Archer was not a man who wasted words, and he had not wasted any here. He wrote that he had heard about Gerald's passing from a man passing through who had come down from Abilene. He wrote that he was sorry for her loss. He wrote that if she was in need of a position, his ranch needed a cook and a housekeeper, and he would pay fair wages and provide room and board, and that the offer was made in complete respect and propriety, and she should not think anything improper by it. She read the letter 4 times. She read the last line of it 6 times. The last line said, "I would be glad to see you, Birdie, more than I have words for." She packed her bag the next morning. The journey from Abilene to Johnson County, Wyoming Territory in November of 1883 was not a gentle one. She took the train as far as Cheyenne, sitting upright in the passenger car with her bag on her lap and watching the land change around her. The flat Kansas plain giving way to something wilder and more vertical, red rock formations rising out of the earth like old arguments. The sky growing larger and more assertive the further north she went. From Cheyenne, she arranged a seat on a freight wagon heading north toward Buffalo, driven by a taciturn man named Mr. Clovis, who communicated primarily in grunts and did not appear to find her presence remarkable in any direction, which she was grateful for. The cold came in from the north like a judgment. She had not packed well enough for Wyoming cold, having spent her whole life in Kansas, where the wind was bitter but not this particular brand of serious. And by the time they were 2 days north of Cheyenne, her hands inside her gloves were stiff, and she had pulled her coat around herself so tightly she felt like a bundle of something rather than a person. But then they came over a ridge on the 3rd afternoon, and she saw the Powder River country spread out below her, the river itself a silver thread through the wide valley, and the land on either side of it golden and brown and immense, the Bighorn Mountains rising to the west against a sky so blue it did not seem real, and she forgot about being cold for exactly 1 minute. She found Andrew's ranch toward evening, following Mr. Clovis's directions, which he delivered in such fragmented units of speech that she was honestly surprised she arrived at the right place. But she did. The house was small, as he had said. 1 story, built of good timber, with a porch that ran across the front and a chimney putting out a steady thread of smoke into the cold air. There was a barn beyond it, and fenced pasture where several horses stood in the amber light of late afternoon, and a well with a bucket, and a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for winter. And in all of it there was something that looked like care, like someone had built this place meaning for it to last. She climbed down from the wagon and Mr. Clovis grunted what she chose to interpret as a farewell and drove on, and she stood in the dirt with her bag and looked at the house, and the door opened and Andrew Archer came out onto the porch. He was wearing his coat and his hat, and he looked older than the last time she had seen him, though it had only been 14 months. But they were not the kind of months that left people unchanged. He looked harder, more weathered, and when he saw her standing there, he went very still in the way that particular kind of man goes still when something matters more to them than they want to let on. He came down the porch steps and crossed the yard and stopped in front of her. "You came," he said. "I told you I would in my letter," she said. "I know," he paused. "I half thought I dreamed the whole correspondence." She almost smiled. "You did not dream it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked at him, and the late light was doing something beautiful to everything around them, the way it does in Wyoming in November when the sun goes low, painting the world in shades of copper and rose. "Come inside," he said. "You must be frozen through." The inside of the house was warm and spare and clean. There was a cast iron stove and a kitchen table and 2 chairs and a bookshelf with a reasonable collection of books on it, which she noticed immediately because she could not help noticing things like that. There was a bedroom at the back and a loft above. There was a rag rug on the floor that someone had made with care. He showed her where she would sleep, the loft up a short ladder with a window that looked out over the river. He had made up a proper bed up there with quilts that smelled of cedar, and there was a hook on the wall for her coat and a small shelf for her things. "It is not much," he said, standing at the foot of the ladder with his hat in his hands. "It is more than enough," she said. They ate supper together that first night, beans and cornbread that he had made, sitting across the table from each other in the lamplight. And they talked. They talked the way people talk when they have 4 years and a great deal of unsaid things to get through, carefully at first and then less carefully, finding their way back to each other the way rivers find their way around obstacles, not directly, but persistently. She learned that he had spent 2 years working cattle drives out of Texas before he came north to Wyoming. She learned that he had spent one brutal winter in a lined shack on the Cheyenne River and nearly lost 2 toes to frostbite. She learned that he had read every book on his shelf twice because winters were long and he was, as he put it with a small, self-deprecating look, a man who thought too much when he was alone. Learned about Gerald, not the details but the shape of it. He did not ask uncomfortable questions. He listened the way he had always listened, with his full attention, his eyes on her face, as if what she was saying was the only thing happening in the world at that moment. "Were you unhappy?" he asked at last, quietly. She considered the question honestly. "I was lonely," she said, "which is not quite the same thing." He nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly the distinction. "Were you?" she asked. He looked at the lamp. "Yes," he said simply. They did not speak of it beyond that. There were proprieties to be observed, and a shape to things that could not be rushed, and both of them had enough sense and enough respect for the other to understand that. But when she climbed the ladder to the loft that night and lay in the cedar-scented darkness and listened to the Powder River wind moving against the walls of the house, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was somewhere she was supposed to be. The weeks that followed established themselves into a rhythm that she found she fit into with a naturalness that surprised her. She cooked breakfast and supper, and sometimes a midday meal if Andrew was working close to the house. She kept the house and did the mending and salted and stored the last of the autumn provisions. She learned the names of the horses. She learned which boards on the porch needed to be stepped over and which could be trusted. She learned that Andrew drank his coffee black and strong, and that he was not a talker in the mornings, being one of those people who needed an hour in silence to become fully present in the day, and she respected that completely because she was the same. He worked from before light to after dark, as ranchers do when winter is coming. He was building a second fence line on the eastern pasture and reinforcing the barn for the season, and she sometimes watched him from the kitchen window, a small figure against the enormous Wyoming sky, steady and purposeful. She learned that he had a hired hand who came 3 days a week, a young man of 19 named Tommy Briggs, who was cheerful and clumsy, and clearly in awe of Andrew in the uncomplicated way young men are sometimes in awe of older men who are good at things. Tommy greeted Birdie with tremendous enthusiasm the first time they met, and accidentally knocked a bucket off the fence in his excitement, and Andrew gave him a look so dry it could have cured leather. She found the rhythm of it comforting, the orderly repetition of ranch life with its demands and its seasons, but what she found more than comforting was Andrew himself, the specific quality of his company, the way he said exactly what he meant and never more, the way he would sometimes come in from the cold and stand by the stove for a moment with his hands out and catch her looking at him, and give her a small half-smile that she was fairly certain was only for her. One evening in early December he came in from the barn with a book under his arm, a worn copy of Great Expectations, and set it on the table beside her place without comment. She looked at it, then at him. "I thought you might want something to read," he said, turning away to hang up his coat. "I have already read it," she said. "How many times?" "3. He turned back with that half-smile. "Then you can read it 4 times. I find it gets better." She read it 4 times that winter. She had been right that it got better. December became January and January became February, and the cold settled in with the kind of absolute authority that Wyoming winter commands, the temperature dropping to things she could not fully comprehend, the wind coming off the bighorns with a force that made conversation impossible outside, and made the inside of the house feel smaller and closer and warmer. They spent the long evenings by the stove, she reading, He working on things with his hands, mending tack or sharpening tools, or sometimes writing in a ledger that she understood, was the account book of the ranch, the careful record of a man trying to build something that would last. He told her about Wyoming territory on those evenings, about the cattle industry that had begun to dominate the country, the big cattle outfits from the east moving in with their money and their political connections, buying up land and water rights and pushing out the smaller ranchers, the homesteaders, the people who had come first and worked hardest. He told her about the tension it was creating, the anger in the valley, the meetings in Buffalo where men with calloused hands and flat bank accounts sat across from representatives of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and understood that the law was not going to protect them. He told her about it with a calm anger she recognized as the most serious kind, the kind that has been sitting with something long enough to stop being surprised by it and start planning what to do about it. "Are you safe?" she asked one evening, looking at him over the book she had stopped pretending to read. He looked up from his ledger. "I am careful," he said. "That is not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She thought about that for a long time after she went up to the loft that night. She thought about what it would mean to watch him ride out in the morning and not be certain he would ride back. She thought about what that uncertainty had already been doing to her for weeks without her fully admitting it to herself. And then she admitted it, lying in the dark listening to the wind, and the admission was large and complicated and did not surprise her at all. She was in love with Andrew Archer. She suspected she had been since she was 16 years old, and he had helped her carry a basket of laundry home from the river in Caldwell, and told her with complete serious conviction that the sunset that evening was the best one he had ever seen. She had thought at the time that she would remember the way he said it for a very long time. She had been right. The question was what to do with it. She was a widow of 8 months, working in his house for wages, sleeping in his loft. There were protocols to these things, and she was not a woman who was careless with protocols, because she had seen what happened to women who were, and she had no desire to become anyone's cautionary tale. She was patient. In March the snow began to ease and the world began its slow unfolding back toward spring, and one afternoon when the weather was mild enough to sit on the porch, she came out with 2 cups of coffee to find Andrew already there, leaning on the railing and looking out at the river which was running high and fast with snowmelt. She handed him the coffee and stood beside him, and they looked at the river together. "Birdie," he said, after a long while. "Yes." He turned to look at her, and there was something resolved in his face that had not been there before, as if he had finally made a decision after a long deliberation. "I have been trying to figure out the right way to say something to you for about 4 months now," he said. "4 months," she said. "That is a long time to think about something. It is a complicated something." He paused. "Or it ought to be complicated. I have been telling myself it is complicated to slow myself down because I know it is too soon, and I know the proper thing would be to wait longer, and I have been trying to be the kind of man who does the proper thing." He looked back at the river. "But I find I cannot keep being quiet about it without it doing damage to me." She turned her coffee cup slowly between her hands. Her heart was doing something notable. "I love you, Birdie," he said, and his voice was steady and simple and had no performance in it at all, just the plain, honest weight of the thing. "I have loved you since we were both barely old enough to know what it meant. I went away and I built something because I meant to come back for you, and I came back too late, and I have spent the last 4 years knowing that and living with it, and now you are here and I find I cannot keep the words inside me anymore." He turned to look at her again. "I am not asking you for anything right now. I know it has not been a year yet since Gerald passed. I know there are proper things to be observed, and I intend to observe them. I just needed you to know what is true, so you know where I stand." She looked at him for a long time. The river ran fast below them, and somewhere along the tree line a meadowlark was trying out its spring song, tentative and bright. "Andrew," she said quietly. "Yes. I have loved you since I was 16 years old." The silence that followed those words was the most complete silence she had ever been inside. It lasted about 3 seconds and felt like a country. He let out a breath that she understood had been held for a very long time. "Then we have been uncommonly wasteful," he said. She laughed. It was a surprised and genuine laugh, the kind that comes out when something is too true and too exactly right to be received with anything more dignified. He smiled at her, a full, real smile, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in 4 years. "I will wait," he said, "as long as it needs to be. The standard," she said, pulling herself together into something more composed, "is 1 year from the date of passing. Gerald died in October. Then I will ask you in November." She gave him a look. "You are already practicing patience." "I am an extremely patient man," he said. "I have spent 4 years on this ranch talking to horses and reading the same 10 books. I know how to wait." She shook her head at him, but she was still smiling, and she turned back to the river and felt the March sun on her face, and somewhere deep in the center of her chest, something that had been cold for a very long time began, carefully and with appropriate deliberation, to warm. Spring arrived in full in April, and with it came Tommy Briggs with the news that one of the bigger cattle outfits from the east, the Consolidated Cattle Company, had filed a claim on the water rights to the northern fork of the creek that ran through Andrew's land, and about a dozen other small ranches in the valley. The claim was tied up in the territorial court, but the Consolidated outfit had lawyers in Cheyenne and connections in the Stock Growers Association, and everyone in the valley knew exactly what that meant. Andrew heard Tommy out without interrupting, standing in the yard with his hands in his pockets and his expression perfectly still. "How many of the other ranchers are affected?" he asked. "At least 11, Tommy said. "Maybe 14 if you count the homesteaders up by Clear Creek." "There will be a meeting in Buffalo," Andrew said. It was not a question. "Friday evening, at the church hall." Andrew looked at Birdie, who had come out onto the porch. She gave him a small nod. "I will be there," he said. The meeting in Buffalo on Friday evening was the first time Birdie had been into town since she arrived, and she understood it as a different kind of place than Abilene or Caldwell. Buffalo in the spring of 1884 was a town that knew itself to be at the edge of something serious. The men at the church hall were ranchers and homesteaders, and a few hired hands who had thrown their loyalty to the small operators, and they had the look of people who had been patient long enough. There were about 40 of them in the wooden pews, and a lawyer from Buffalo named James Whitfield, who had agreed to represent the small ranchers in the water rights case. Andrew sat in the third row and Birdie sat beside him, which she had considered briefly and then done without apology. She was not a woman who sat at the back and observed. She listened with full attention as the lawyer outlined the case, as the ranchers asked their questions in the flat, direct way of men who needed facts rather than reassurances, as the shape of the injustice assembled itself clearly in the lamplight of the church hall. The Consolidated Company had not settled this land, had not built on it, worked it, endured its winters. They had money and lawyers and political friends, and the law in Wyoming territory in 1884 was still young enough to be bent by those things, and everyone in the room knew it. Afterward, standing outside in the warm spring dark while the men talked in clusters, Andrew introduced her to his neighbor, a rancher named Cal Whitmore, who ran cattle on the land adjacent to Andrew's to the south. Cal was around 40, a big square man with a weathered face and an honest handshake, and his wife Ellen was with him, a small, sharp-eyed woman of about 35 who looked Birdie over with the frank assessment of someone who had learned early to read people quickly. "You are the one keeping house for Andrew," Ellen said, not unkindly, just directly. "I am," Birdie said. Ellen looked between them with the kind of calm knowing that women develop when they are paying attention to the world. "Good," she said simply, in a tone that suggested she had assessed the entire situation and approved of it. "Cal thinks Andrew is going to run himself into an early grave out there by himself. I have been telling him for 2 years the man needed someone sensible." Andrew overheard this and looked at the middle distance in the direction of a fence post with studied neutrality. Birdie liked Ellen Whitmore immediately and completely. The lawsuit proceeded through spring and summer with the slowness of all legal proceedings, and the valley waited and worked, and the tension ran like a current under the ordinary business of ranching. Andrew threw himself into the season with a ferocity that she understood was partly necessity and partly a way of managing what he could not control, and she matched him in her way, keeping the house, expanding the kitchen garden, learning to put up preserves from Ellen Whitmore, who came by twice a week, and had become the friend Birdie had not known she was missing. On a hot afternoon in July, she and Ellen were sitting on the porch working on a quilt that Ellen had proposed and Birdie had agreed to, mostly because she liked Ellen's company, and Ellen said, out of nowhere in the middle of a conversation about the best method for putting up green beans, "He watches you, you know, when you are not looking, when you are looking too, but more when you are not." Birdie kept her eyes on her needlework. "I am aware," she said. "And you?" Ellen asked. Birdie set down her needle and looked out at the mountains. "And I," she confirmed. Ellen nodded once with satisfaction, as if this confirmed a theory she had been maintaining for some time, and returned to her green beans, and nothing more was said about it, which was exactly the right amount. The water rights case resolved in October, not in favor of the small ranchers, which surprised no one, but the resolution had terms attached to it that the lawyer Whitfield had negotiated with enough skill that the consolidated company could not entirely seal off the northern fork. The small ranchers retained partial rights. It was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was the kind of outcome that the law tends to produce when the parties have unequal power and equal stubbornness. And the men of the valley received it with the philosophical resignation of people who understand that they are going to have to keep fighting, and were expecting no different. Andrew came home from Buffalo the evening of the ruling and found supper on the table and Birdie in the kitchen, and he told her the outcome in the straightforward way he told her everything, and she listened and asked 2 precise questions and then said, "The terms Whitfield negotiated were better than they should have been given the leverage. He is a good lawyer." Andrew looked at her across the table. "You have been following this the entire time," he said, not as an accusation, as an observation with something warm inside it. "Did you think I had not been?" "No," he said. "I knew you had. I just like hearing you say so." November came in like a promise kept, the aspens along the river already bare and the mornings carrying the first hard frost of the season. On the 3rd of November, Andrew came in from the early morning chores and she was at the stove, and he took off his hat and stood in the middle of the kitchen and said, without preamble, "It has been more than a year." She turned from the stove. He was standing straight and still the way he did when something was important to him, his hat in both hands. "It has," she said. "I told you I would ask you in November," he said. "You did." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no difficulty reading, because she had been reading Andrew Archer's face for half her life. It was the face of a man who was both absolutely certain and entirely terrified, and she found it the most honest face she had ever seen. "Birdie Turner," he said. "I would like very much for you to be my wife. I have nothing elaborate to offer. I have this land and this house and the work of building something real on it. I have a good horse and a bad stove and a library of 10 books that you have now read more times than I have. I have every intention of making you happy if you will let me, and I will not waste a day of whatever time we have." He paused. "I have been in love with you for 8 years and I do not expect to stop, if you will have me." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and she reached up and put her hand along the side of his face, the side with the pale scar she had never asked about, and she felt him hold very still under her touch. "Yes," she said. "Andrew Archer, the answer is yes, and it has been yes for 8 years." He closed his eyes for one brief moment. Then he opened them and they were very bright. He put his hand over hers, holding it against his cheek. "Good," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "That is very good." She laughed softly, and then he was kissing her, careful and certain at once, and the kitchen was full of the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the November light was coming through the window and making everything the color of the best thing she had ever seen. They were married in the church at Buffalo on the first Saturday of December, 1884. Ellen Whitmore stood up with Birdie, and Cal Whitmore stood up with Andrew, and Tommy Briggs sat in the front row looking like he personally had arranged the entire thing and was extremely pleased with himself about it. The preacher was a young man named Reverend Cole, who had only been in Wyoming territory 6 months, and gave a sermon that ran about twice as long as strictly necessary, but neither of them minded. When the ceremony was over and they walked out of the church into the cold December air, she was wearing Andrew Archer's grandmother's ring, which he had been carrying in his breast pocket since September, and her hand was in his. And she felt the solidity of him beside her and the solid feel of the cold air and the solid reality of the life they were going to build. And it was the realest thing she had ever touched. The reception was held at the Whitmore Ranch, because Ellen had insisted, and because the Whitmore kitchen was substantially larger than Andrew's, and half the valley seemed to have come. There was fiddle music and dancing, and considerably more whiskey than the December night strictly required, and Birdie danced with Andrew twice, and with Cal Whitmore once, and with Tommy Briggs once, during which he stepped on her foot 3 times and apologized 4 times, and she told him on the 4th apology that she had been stepped on harder and not to worry about it. At some point in the evening she found herself standing at the edge of the room with her punch cup watching Andrew across the space, watching him talk to Cal and the lawyer Whitfield and 2 other ranchers she knew by sight, watching the way he listened and the way he spoke and the particular quality of presence he had, which was the quality of a man who was fully in the place where he stood. Ellen appeared at her elbow. "You look like a woman who is extremely happy and slightly bewildered by it," she said. "I feel like a woman who is extremely happy and slightly bewildered by it," Birdie said. Ellen smiled, which on Ellen was a small and infrequent and therefore valuable thing. "That is exactly how it should feel," she said. "At least for a while, then it settles into something quieter but deeper. The bewilderment goes away, the happy stays." Birdie looked at her. "Is that what happened to you and Cal?" "Cal and I had a courtship that involved a runaway horse, a lost cattle herd, and a dispute over a fence line," Ellen said. "But yes, broadly speaking." Birdie laughed. "I find that does not surprise me at all." Andrew looked across the room at that moment and found her eyes, and she felt the look like a warm hand between her shoulder blades, easy and certain, and belonging entirely to her. The first year of their marriage was the year she learned what it was to have a full life in the proper sense of the word. Not a life that was simply occupied or endured, but one that had color and texture and meaning in all the ordinary spaces of it. She learned Andrew's ways the way you learn the geography of a country you have chosen to inhabit, with pleasure and attention. She learned that he was patient with animals and occasionally impatient with people who were unkind, which she considered a reasonable balance. She learned that he was a better cook than he had let on, having developed real skill in his years of solitary bachelor cooking, and that he was secretly pleased when she complimented his biscuits. She learned that he woke early and lay still for a few minutes before rising, and that in those minutes he was aware she was awake and would sometimes reach across and find her hand in the dark, just for a moment, before the day began in earnest. She learned that that gesture was one of the most profound things anyone had ever offered her. He learned her in return, with the same attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. He learned that she was braver than she let on. He learned that she had strong opinions on the management of the kitchen garden, and would voice them at full volume if he tried to suggest improvements. He learned that she cried at the end of Great Expectations every single time, and would deny it if asked. In the spring of 1885, she told him she was expecting a child. He was at the kitchen table with his ledger when she told him, and he looked up from it, and for a moment his face went through about 6 different things in rapid succession, and then it settled into an expression She did not have a word for except that it made her eyes sting. He pushed back from the table and came to her and took her face in both hands and looked at her for a long, serious moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling very well," she said. He kissed her forehead with the concentrated reverence of a man offering something up to something larger than himself. Then he held her against him and she could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. "We will need to make the loft into a proper room," he said, his voice slightly muffled against her hair. She laughed. "That is what you are thinking about right now." "I am thinking about approximately 40 things right now," he said. "That is the only one I have any control over." He built the room over the course of the spring, expanding the loft into a full second room with a proper window and a door at the top of the stairs. He replaced the ladder with. Tommy Briggs helped with the construction and was so enthusiastic and well-meaning about it that he only had to be redirected from actual structural catastrophe twice. In October of 1885, their son was born. He came into the world on a Wednesday morning in the bedroom of the Powder River house, with the midwife from Buffalo attending, a capable and unflappable woman named Mrs. Greer, who had delivered approximately 100 babies in Johnson County and took the whole business as a manageable matter of work. He was healthy and large and had Andrew's dark hair and Birdie's particular expression of focused determination, which she pointed out to Andrew approximately 2 hours after the birth, lying exhausted and entirely satisfied in the bed, and Andrew, sitting beside her with the baby in his arms looking at him with the expression of a man who has been ambushed by something beautiful, said quietly, "He has your stubbornness already. I can see it. We are going to have our hands full." "You love it," she said. "Completely," he agreed. They named him Thomas James Archer, after Andrew's father James and after Tommy Briggs, which they did not tell Tommy about until Christmas. And when they did tell him, he sat down hard in the nearest chair and could not speak for about 2 minutes, and then stood up and shook Andrew's hand with great emotion, and told Birdie it was the finest thing that had ever happened to him, which she believed entirely. Thomas James Archer was a person of enormous energy from the first. By the time he was pulling himself upright on the furniture, he was already trying to reach things that were clearly not intended for him, and by the time he was walking he was doing it at a pace that was much closer to running, and by the time he was 2 he had an opinion about everything and the voice to express it, which he exercised at every opportunity. Andrew was besotted. There was no other word for it. He was a man who held things close and did not show sentiment easily, but Thomas dismantled all of that without effort or intention. Birdie would sometimes come around the side of the barn and find the 2 of them. Andrew crouched down to Thomas's level, showing him how to tie a knot or how to hold a tool or explaining in patient detail the name and function of whatever creature or piece of equipment they were examining, and Thomas watching his father with the complete serious attention of a small person who has correctly identified the most important source of information in his world. In the spring of 1887, the trouble in the valley turned serious. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, backed by the large cattle outfits and their Eastern money, had begun a campaign against what they called cattle rustling among the small ranchers, but everyone in the valley understood that the rustling claims were a pretext for a broader effort to drive out the small operators. Men were being blacklisted, unable to sell their cattle at any legitimate market. Legal pressure was being applied in ways that small operations could not sustain. There were rumors of worse to come. Andrew came home one evening in April looking like a man who had seen something and was deciding how much to say about it. "Tell me," Birdie said, putting supper on the table. He sat down and looked at his hands for a moment. "They have hired men," he said. "Regulators they are calling them, professional gunmen brought in from out of the territory. The association has a list." She set down the spoon she was holding. "A list. Names," he said, "of small ranchers and homesteaders they intend to make examples of. Are you on it?" He looked at her directly. "I do not know for certain. It is possible." She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. Thomas was asleep in the back room and the lamp was burning, and outside the Wyoming evening was doing its beautiful violent thing with color, and inside this house she had built a life with this man and her son was sleeping 20 feet away. "What do we do?" she asked. "I am going to Buffalo tomorrow," he said. "There is a meeting. The ranchers are organizing. We are not going to simply wait." "I am going with you," she said. He looked at her. "I am going with you," she repeated, in the tone that he had learned over the course of 2 years of marriage, meant the subject was not in fact open. He nodded once. "We will ask Ellen to mind Thomas." The situation in Johnson County through the summer of 1887 walked the edge of something that could have gone badly and ultimately did not, though not for lack of trying on the part of the large interests. The organized resistance of the small ranchers, backed by enough community solidarity and enough local political support to make the association's legal maneuvers costly, eventually persuaded the regulators that Johnson County was not going to be the example they had hoped. They retreated, which was not a solution and everyone knew it, but it was a reprieve. And in the West in those years, a reprieve was not nothing. Andrew came through it without harm, and so did Cal Whitmore and the other men of the valley who had held together. And Birdie, who had been in the background of all of it doing the thing that women in those situations have always done, which is to say keeping everything functioning and everyone fed and the information flowing and the morale from collapsing, never asked for acknowledgement of any of it and received most of it from Ellen Whitmore anyway. In the form of a blunt, "You handled this well," delivered over a kitchen table, which she valued more than any formal commendation. By the autumn of 1887, the valley had settled back into the ordinary serious work of ranching, and Birdie told Andrew she was expecting again. Their second child was a daughter, born in the summer of 1888 on the hottest day of the year, which both parents agreed was a fitting introduction for someone who turned out to have a personality of considerable warmth and insistence. They named her Clara Mee Archer, and from the beginning she was entirely different from her brother, not in the volume of her opinions, which was comparable, but in the expression of them, which where Thomas was direct and practical was in Clara more oblique and more observant, as if she was taking a longer view of everything before committing. Thomas regarded his sister with initial skepticism that transformed over the course of her first year into a protective attachment so fierce and particular that Andrew told Birdie privately it reminded him of someone, and she had thrown a dish towel at him. The ranch grew. Andrew expanded the herd carefully, buying good stock and culling carefully, and building the reputation that would allow him to sell at prices that kept the operation genuinely solvent. He added pasture land when the opportunity arose, and he managed the water rights he held with the kind of vigilant attention that the valley required. He hired 2 permanent hands by 1889 to replace Tommy Briggs, who had gone south to New Mexico Territory the year before to start his own operation, something that both Andrew and Birdie were proud of in the specific way you are proud of someone you have watched grow up. Tommy wrote letters. They were, as letters from Tommy tended to be, enthusiastic and somewhat breathless and full of news he considered vital that was mostly about horses and weather. Birdie answered every one. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, which the valley celebrated with a degree of seriousness that Birdie found touching, the citizens of a young country marking the moment with the understanding that it mattered, that the designation was real and changed things, even if the changes would take years to fully arrive. Andrew came home from Buffalo on the day the news arrived with a bottle of good whiskey that he had paid too much for and opened on the porch that evening, and they sat in the last of the July light with their glasses and looked at the river and the mountains and the land they had built a life on. "Wyoming," she said. "State of Wyoming," he confirmed. "Does it feel different?" he considered. "Not yet," he said. "Ask me in 10 years." She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and Thomas, who was 4 1/2 and deeply invested in whatever the adults around him were doing, came out onto the porch and demanded to know why there was a celebration and what the whiskey was and could he have some. "Absolutely not," Andrew said, "but you can sit with us." Thomas sat with them, wedged between them on the bench, and they sat there in the summer evening and looked at the state of Wyoming together. In 1890, one Birdie organized the first lending library in their part of the county, collecting books from everyone in the valley who had any to spare and establishing a system of exchange that ran on the honor system and mostly worked. Andrew built the shelves for it in the back room of the church, and Ellen Whitmore donated 40 books that she said she had read twice already and had no further use for, though Birdie noticed she continued to borrow from the library with regularity. It was a small thing, in the scale of things that were happening in the world, in the history of the territory and the country. But it was the kind of small thing that Birdie had learned were the actual material of a life, the accumulated small careful acts of making a community into a place where people were not just surviving but growing. She had grown up in the West without much softness, and she understood that what softness existed in it had been put there by ordinary stubborn women who decided it was going to exist whether the landscape cooperated or not. In 1892, the second serious trouble came to Johnson County, and this time it was not averted. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, having failed in their earlier efforts, organized an invasion of Johnson County with an armed force of approximately 50 men, cattlemen and hired guns from Texas, loaded into a train in Cheyenne and dispatched northward with a kill list, and the evident expectation that the governor and the president would support them or at least look away. Andrew heard about it from a rider coming up the road at dawn on a Wednesday, a local rancher named Pete Ronan, who had ridden through the night to spread the warning. Birdie was in the kitchen when Andrew came in from talking to Pete, and his face was composed but his eyes were serious in a way she recognized from 4 years of reading him. "They are in the county," he said. She turned from the stove. "How many?" 50, Pete says, armed. "They have already hit one place south of here." She thought for exactly 3 seconds. "The children need to go to Ellen's." "Yes," he said. "And I am not going with them," she said, in the same tone she had used in 1887. He looked at her for a moment. Birdie, Andrew, the look between them was full and understood. "Stay close to the house," he said. "I will," he nodded. Then he crossed to her and kissed her hard and certain, and held her face in his hands for one moment, and she pressed her hand flat against his chest over his heart for one moment. "Come back," she said. "I always come back to you," he said. The Johnson County War, as it came to be known afterward, was a week of tension and a siege, and ultimately the intervention of federal troops dispatched by President Harrison at the request of the governor, which resolved the immediate crisis in a way that left everyone dissatisfied for different reasons, but at least alive. Andrew rode out with the other valley ranchers, and rode back 6 days later with a cut along his forearm from a fence wire in the dark, and dry dust on everything he owned. He came through the door and found her in the kitchen, and she crossed to him and examined the arm and cleaned it and wrapped it without speaking, because there were no words for the relief of a thing that large, and then she made him sit down and eat while he was still too tired to argue, which was the only time he did not argue about sitting down and eating. That night, lying in the dark, he said quietly, "The third time I could not do it." She turned her head to look at him in the darkness. "What do you mean?" "I left Caldwell," he said. "That was the first time I said goodbye to you. And then when I came back and found you married to Gerald and I stood at your gate and I said goodbye again. That was the second time." He paused and she lay very still and listened. "When I rode out this week, I stood at the top of the road and I looked back at the house and I tried to say it in my head the way I had before. Goodbye, just in case. The way sensible men do when they do not know what they are riding into." His voice was quiet and steady and completely honest. I could not form the word, not even inside my own head. I tried and there was nothing there but everything I was riding back to. She turned toward him in the dark, and he pulled her close, and she lay against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong, the same heartbeat she had pressed her hand to in the kitchen that morning. "Do not practice it," she said softly. "There is no need for that word between us any more." His arm tightened around her. "No," he said, "there is not." She listened to his breathing slow towards sleep and lay awake a little longer herself. Not anxiously, but because she did not want to waste the particular quality of the quiet that surrounded them. The house on the Powder River, with its cedar smell and its rag rug and its 2 sleeping children, and its 10-book library expanded now to 60. The mountains to the west that had not moved in all the years they had been here. The river running somewhere below in the dark, faithful and constant. She had come to this place in November with a single bag and $32, and a love she had been carrying so long it had become structural, as necessary to her as bone. She had built something here that she could not have imagined from the porch of Gerald Holt's ranch in Abilene, looking at the flat horizon and trying to believe it was enough. She had been wrong about horizons, she thought. They were not walls. They were just where the story was still arriving from. Andrew slept, and she listened to the river and was glad. The years that followed were full years, shaped by the seasons and the work and the particular richness of a life that knows itself. Thomas grew up with the land in his hands the way Andrew had, certain and capable, showing by the time he was 8 a seriousness about horses that made both of them proud and privately amused. Clara grew up with her mother's stubborn care for the world around her, reading everything in the library twice and asking questions that required more thought than most answers, and learning from Ellen Whitmore's sharp example that a woman with intelligence and purpose was not an anomaly in the West, but simply a woman who had decided to fully exist. In the winter of 1894, when Thomas was 9 and Clara was 6, Birdie told Andrew she was expecting for the 3rd time. He was chopping wood when she came out to tell him, and he set down the axe and looked at her with the same undone expression he had worn in 1885 when she told him the first time, and she thought that some expressions do not lose their power no matter how many times they appear on a face. "You are doing that thing with your face again," she said. "I cannot help that," he said. She smiled. He crossed to her and put his hand against her cheek, and she leaned into it. "Are you well?" "Extremely." "Good." He looked at her for another moment. "I am going to have to build something bigger," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "The house is not small, Andrew." "It is about to be smaller," he said, but his eyes were warm with it. The 3rd child was another boy. They named him Henry Cal Archer, the Cal for Cal Whitmore, who received the news with the same emotion Tommy Briggs had received the naming of Thomas James, sitting down hard and going quiet, and then gripping Andrew's hand and saying simply, "I am honored, son," which made Andrew's jaw tighten in the way she knew meant he was moved past easy speech. Henry came into the world in the spring of 1895, looking like Birdie's side of the family, which had not been seen in any of the other children, with lighter coloring and her particular expression of interested observation of everything happening around him. Thomas regarded him with the skepticism of a firstborn who had already been through this process once and knew what it led to. Clara regarded him with complete delight and appointed herself his primary interpreter to the world, a role she maintained for the rest of her childhood. By 1896, the Archer Ranch was a real operation, not a scraping survival but a genuine going concern with 60 head of cattle, a good remuda of horses, 2 steady hired hands named Frank and Earl, and a kitchen garden that Birdie had expanded to a proper kitchen and herb garden, and small orchard of hardy apple trees that Andrew had planted 5 years earlier along the southern fence, trees that were now producing their first real fruit. She stood in the orchard in September of that year, picking apples into a basket, the mountains visible over the fence to the west, the river glinting below, her children's voices somewhere behind the barn where they were involved in something she was choosing not to know about in detail. Andrew came around the corner of the fence and found her there, and stood for a moment watching her the way he had been watching her for 14 years, with the particular quality of attention that never seemed to diminish. "You are staring," she said without turning around. "I am," he agreed, coming to stand beside her. She handed him the basket to hold and continued picking. He held the basket and watched the mountains. "Frank found a new water source on the east pasture," he said, "spring-fed. If it holds through the dry season, it changes things considerably. That is good news. It is very good news." He paused. "We could take on another 20 head next spring if the water holds." She handed him 2 apples and he put them in the basket. The smell of them was clean and bright in the September air. "Ellen was by this morning," she said. "She says Cal's knee is giving him real trouble this year. I know. I am going to see if they will let me send Frank to help them through the fall." She looked at him sideways. "They will not accept charity." "It is not charity, it is a neighbor arrangement. We have been doing it for 12 years. She considered this. "You may be right. I frequently am," he said, with a completely straight face. She gave him the look that had been her response to that particular expression since approximately 1884, and he gave her the half-smile that was his answer to that look, and they had been having that exchange for long enough that it ran on pure instinct now, as easy and automatic as breathing. She took the basket from him and set it down and turned to face him properly. The September light was doing what September light does in Wyoming, which is to make everything look like the final frame of something. "Andrew," she said. "Yes. I am happy," she said. "I want you to know that. I am genuinely and completely happy." He looked at her for a moment and she watched something in him become very still and very full at once. "So am I," he said quietly. "I would like you to know that too." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, his thumb resting briefly against her cheek, and she turned her face into his hand for a moment in the way she had been doing since the first winter on this ranch, when she understood that his touch was one of the reliable and lasting things of her world. "We did all right," she said. He looked at the mountains, then at the orchard, then at her face. "We did considerably better than all right," he said. She picked up the apple basket and they walked back toward the house together, the mountains behind them and the river below them and the sound of their children somewhere ahead. And the life they had built was all around them, solid and breathing and real. The winter of 1896 was the gentlest they had known, as if the season had decided to be kind after the long years of hard ones. The Powder River froze only at the edges, and the snow came in manageable amounts, and the house was full on the evenings, Thomas reading at the table with the focused intensity he brought to everything, Clara drawing with a stub of pencil she had already worn to almost nothing, and needed to be talked into accepting a new one, Henry falling asleep against Andrew's side after supper with the ease of a small person who is entirely certain of the safety of his world. On a January evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Andrew poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down across from her, and they sat together in the lamplight the way they had been sitting together for 12 years, comfortable in the silence that had stopped being empty a very long time ago. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" He turned his cup in his hands. "About Caldwell," he said. "About the day I got on that stagecoach. About how young and stupid I was." She looked at him. "You were not stupid. You were trying to do the right thing." "I was trying to do the right thing in a way that cost us 4 years," he said. "And then the years afterward cost us more," she said. "But here we are." He looked at her directly. "Here we are," he said, with a weight to it that was acknowledgement and gratitude and something that did not quite have a name but sat between them like a warm fire. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "If I had known," she said slowly, "when I stood at that gate in Abilene watching you ride away the second time, that this was where we were going to end up. This house. Those children. This," she pressed her hand against his. "I would not have wanted you to make the first goodbye any shorter, because everything that happened made us exactly the people who built this. Does that make sense?" He was quiet for a moment, then he turned his hand over and held hers. "It makes complete sense," he said, "and I have thought something like it myself, and I am grateful for it." "Good," she said. "Then we are agreed." "We are usually agreed," he said. Eventually, she gave him the look, he gave her the smile. She squeezed his hand and released it and picked up her coffee. And outside, the January wind was moving against the house with its customary announcement of existence. But inside it was warm and lamplit and absolutely itself. In the spring of 1897, Thomas Archer, at 11 years old, began in earnest what everyone around him had understood was inevitable for about 5 years, which was to become a horseman of real ability. He had a gift that went beyond what Andrew could teach him, some intuitive understanding of horses that was native to him and needed only to be cultivated. And the two of them spent long hours in the corral that spring working with a young gelding that Frank said was too spirited to be useful, and Thomas quietly insisted was simply misunderstood. Andrew told Birdie one evening, watching from the fence while Thomas worked the gelding in a slow, careful circle, that the boy was going to be better with horses than he was, which he said without any evident distress and with something that sounded very much like satisfaction. "He has your patience," she said. "He has your stubbornness," Andrew returned. "Those are the same thing in this context," she said. Andrew looked at her with an expression of long-suffering fondness. "They absolutely are not." Clara, at 9, had by this point read every book in the lending library that was appropriate for her age and a number that were technically for older readers, which she had obtained by climbing the shelves when Birdie was not watching, and which she read under the covers at night, believing herself undetected. She was in this matter, as in several others, overconfident in her own invisibility. Birdie had a conversation with her about the under-the-covers reading one evening that involved no prohibition on the reading itself, and a fairly detailed discussion of the books in question, and what Clara thought about them. A conversation that lasted 2 hours, and ended with Birdie quietly thinking that this particular daughter was going to need a larger world than Johnson County, Wyoming, and fully intending to make sure she found it. Henry, at 2, was at the age where he had opinions about everything and the mobility to act on them, and was a daily adventure in parenting that kept everyone on their feet. He had developed a particular friendship with Frank, the hired hand, who was a patient man of 40 with no children of his own, and who allowed Henry to follow him through his morning chores with a seriousness that Frank met with complete respect, explaining everything he did in detail to the small person beside him, as if Henry's understanding were essential to the operation. It was not a small thing, Birdie thought, the way the ranch functioned as a community, the way the people on it and around it were connected in the particular texture of a life built in a specific place over time. Cal and Ellen Whitmore, who had been there from the beginning. Tommy Briggs writing his breathless letters from New Mexico. Frank and Earl, who had been with them for 7 years and were as much a part of the place as the fence lines. The lending library. The church meetings. The valley that had fought for itself and come through it with its community intact. She had grown up without roots, following her father from town to town in the difficult years before he settled in Caldwell, and she had understood for a long time that roots were something you grew and not something you found, that a place became home through the accumulated deposit of living in it, season by season and year by year, and that this was not a limitation but the most honest kind of abundance there was. She was rooted now. They both were. Rooted in this valley, in this house, in each other, in the 3 particular people who had arrived in the world through the particular miracle of the 2 of them choosing each other. In the summer of 1898, California and Wyoming and all the states between them and beyond them were caught up in the news of the war with Spain, which was being fought in places so far from the Powder River Valley that they felt almost fictional, Cuba and the Philippines, names from maps rather than places any of them had stood in. The news came in the newspaper that made its way to Buffalo and then to the valley, weeks old by the time it arrived, and they read it and discussed it and felt the strangeness of a country that was becoming larger and more complicated than the country they had grown up in. Andrew read the news with careful attention, and kept his opinions to himself in public, and shared them with Birdie in the evenings in the specific way. He shared things that mattered to him, not at length but precisely, the essential architecture of his thought in as few words as possible. Thomas, at 12, wanted to know everything about the war with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a boy, and Andrew sat with him and answered his questions, and gently shaped them toward the more complex questions of why and what it meant, and who paid the costs, in the way that good fathers do when they are trying to teach a person to think rather than simply to be informed. Birdie listened to those conversations from the kitchen, stirring something on the stove or mending something at the table, and thought of all the things she wanted her children to understand about the world and how Andrew was already teaching them, not through lectures but through example, through the way he engaged with hard questions, through the way he treated people, through the way he treated her. One evening she said to him, "You are a good father." He looked up from the newspaper with mild surprise at the directness of it. "You do not have to look surprised," she said. "I am stating a fact." "I am not sure I do it correctly," he said honestly. "No one does it correctly," she said. "But you do it with love and attention, which is what matters most." He looked at her for a moment. "You are the one who does the real work of it," he said. "I ride out in the morning. You are here all day, keeping everything together, keeping them growing right." "We both are," she said firmly. "It is not a competition." He almost smiled. "When did I suggest it was a competition? You were beginning to give me credit I do not deserve exclusively, which is the same thing." He set down the newspaper. "You are a very difficult woman to compliment." "I am not asking for compliments," she said. "I am asking you to stop distributing credit in ways that leave you out." He looked at her with the full warmth of 12 years of marriage. "Birdie Turner Archer," he said, using all of it, which he only did when he was making a point. "You are the most determined person I have ever known." "Good," she said. "That is exactly how I intend to be perceived." He laughed. It was a full, real laugh, the one that he did not produce for general audiences, and she had been collecting every instance of it for 12 years and was not close to tired of it. By the turn of the century, the ranch was solid and settled, and the family that had grown in it was solid and settled with it. Thomas was 14 and spent every hour he was not in the schoolhouse in the corral or on horseback, and the gelding that Frank had called too-spirited was now the best working horse on the ranch by a considerable margin, which Thomas received with quiet satisfaction and Frank received with the good grace of a man who is happy to have been wrong. Clara was 11 and had outgrown the lending library, or at least the section of it that was not constantly being renewed, and Birdie had written to the state library in Cheyenne and arranged for a rotating selection of new titles to come in with the freight wagon twice a year, which Clara treated as a personal supply drop and which she was not wrong about. Henry was 5 and had the particular quality of a youngest child, who has had the benefit of all the mistakes being worked out on the preceding children, which is to say, he was easygoing and observant and possessed of a kind of cheerful certainty about the world that neither of his siblings had had at his age. He was also, as Clara had correctly identified at his birth, an excellent audience, and the two of them had developed an entertainment partnership of sorts in which Clara narrated and Henry listened with satisfaction, a dynamic that Birdie found both entirely recognizable and somewhat alarming. On the first day of the new century, the 1st of January, 1900, Andrew and Birdie stood on the porch in the cold morning air while the children still slept inside, and they looked out at the valley. The mountains were white against a blue sky, so clean it looked new, and the river was frozen and still, and the land was quiet with the particular quiet of a winter morning at the beginning of something. "A new century," she said. "So they tell me," he said. "Does it feel different?" He considered it honestly, the way he considered everything. "It feels like a Thursday morning," he said, "which I find reassuring." She laughed and leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the cold together, watching the new century be a Thursday morning over the Powder River Valley, and it was exactly the right way to begin. The years continued to accumulate in the slow, generous way of good years, each one adding something to the weight and richness of the whole. Thomas, at 17, was a horseman of real regional reputation, selling broke horses to ranchers throughout the county and working summers for a horse trader in Buffalo who recognized what he had and paid him accordingly. Clara, at 15, had corresponded herself into an arrangement with a teacher in Cheyenne who was willing to send her the coursework for a more advanced education than the county school provided, and was working through it with a ferocity that Birdie recognized as her own stubbornness fully engaged. Henry, at 9, had decided he was going to be a rancher like his father and approached this ambition with the systematic seriousness of a person who has identified their life's work and sees no reason to waste time about it. Andrew watched his children become themselves with the attentive pleasure of a man who has been given more than he expected and knows it. He worked the ranch with the same steady care he had brought to it from the beginning, expanding slowly and thoughtfully, building something that could sustain itself and eventually sustain the people who came after him. He was 41 in 1902, and Birdie was 39, and they were, she thought, in the good deep middle of their lives, past the difficulty of the beginnings and not yet at the difficulty of the endings, in the long fertile middle where everything that had been planted was growing. She told him this one evening in those exact terms, and he looked at her with a slow smile. "The long fertile middle," he repeated. "That sounds like a botanical treatise." "Do not be dismissive of botanical language," she said. "It is precise." He shook his head. "I married a very unusual woman." "You did," she agreed pleasantly. "You are extremely fortunate." "I know," he said simply, without irony or humor, just the plain statement of a man who has understood something true about his life for a long time and does not mind saying so. She looked at him across the evening and felt the fullness of it, all of it, the boy at the stagecoach in Caldwell, and the man at the gate in Abilene, and the voice through the door of this house on a November afternoon, and the ring on a winter morning and every season since, compressing into this moment, and this face, and this particular life. She had been loved imperfectly, and then lost, and then found, and then loved completely. And the distance between those two kinds of love was the whole of what she had learned in 39 years, and what she had learned was this: the second kind is not reward for enduring the first. It is simply what becomes possible when two people are finally in the same place at the same time and brave enough to remain there. She reached across the table and took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "You," she said. "The whole of you, the boy and the man. How long I have known you." He turned her hand over in both of his, looking at it as if the particular map of it still interested him. "I have been thinking lately," he said slowly, "about the night I came back to Caldwell, when I went looking for you the first time. I went to your father's house, and the neighbor told me he had passed and you had gone to Abilene. And I sat on my horse outside your father's empty house, and I thought about what I had cost us with my waiting." He paused. "And then I thought about riding to Abilene and what I was going to find there, because people do not stop living because you are away. And I think I knew before I saw the ring, what I was riding toward." "Did you come anyway?" she asked, though she knew. "Yes," he said, "because I needed to see you, even if seeing you was painful, even if it meant saying goodbye again." "That second goodbye was worse than the first," she said quietly. "Yes," he agreed. "Because the first one I thought was temporary, the second one I thought was permanent. And then you came north," she said, "and built all of this." He looked around the kitchen, the stove, the lamp, the window with its view of the dark yard and the stars above the barn. "And then you came here," he said, "and knocked everything permanent about permanent." He looked at her. "And I have been grateful every single day since." She was quiet for a moment. "Even the days with Thomas and the fence," she said. He closed his eyes briefly in the manner of a man revisiting a memory he would prefer to have deleted. "Thomas and the fence was an exception," he said. She laughed, and he held her hand, and the lamp burned between them, and the house held them in the way good houses hold the people who have made a life inside them, attentively and without fuss. On a morning in the October of 1903, Thomas Archer came to breakfast with the particular expression of a young man who has made a decision and is still working out how to announce it. He was 18 years old and had been 18 old enough to have his own opinions become inarguable, which both his parents understood, and had been observing with the mixture of pride and careful attention that the parents of 18-year-olds are required to maintain. He sat down and ate most of his breakfast and then said, "I have an offer from a horse outfit in Montana. They want someone who can break and train, and they are offering a fair wage and a percentage. I would like to go." Andrew looked at Birdie across the table. She looked back at him. "How long would you be gone?" Andrew asked. "A season to start," Thomas said. "Maybe longer if it suits both parties." "Montana," Birdie said. "Yes," Thomas said. He looked at his mother with the directness he had always had, the quality of looking at her straight on with no deflection. "I know it is far." "It is not the far that concerns me," she said. "It is whether you are ready for something that independent." He met her eyes. "I think I am." She looked at him, this person she had watched become himself over 18 years, the focused, serious boy who had grown into a focused, serious young man. And she thought of Andrew at 19 getting on a stagecoach in Caldwell because he was trying to build something before he could ask for anything. And she thought about what it meant to let people become what they needed to become. "Yes," she said. "I think you are too." Thomas let out a breath that she recognized as the release of a long-held thing. Andrew nodded once. "You write to us, every 2 weeks at minimum." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "And if the outfit is not what they represented themselves to be, you come home. No argument." "Yes, sir. And," Birdie said, "you eat properly. I'm not having you coming back here looking like a fence post." Thomas looked at her with the small private smile that was his father's smile on his face. "Yes, ma'am." He left in November, which was the kind of coincidence that the universe arranges without caring whether you find it poetic. Birdie stood on the porch and watched him ride out, and she did not cry. She had long since made her peace with the fact that the work of making a person well is the work of preparing them to leave, and that the leaving, when it was freely chosen and well prepared for, was not loss but completion. She went inside and found Andrew at the kitchen table with his hands around his coffee cup, looking at the middle distance. She sat across from him and put her hands over his. He looked at her. His eyes were very bright. "He will be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "He is yours," she said. "He will be absolutely fine." Andrew looked down at her hands on his. "He is yours too," he said quietly. "He has been the best parts of both of us." She held his hands, and they sat there in the quiet of the kitchen with their son's particular absence already making itself known in the shape of the room, the way the absence of any truly necessary thing makes itself known, and they sat with it together, which was the only way to sit with things that large. By Christmas, Thomas had written 3 letters, all of them about horses, all of them with a current of aliveness in them that told her everything she needed to know. He was flourishing. She could feel it in every sentence, the particular quality of a person doing exactly what they are made to do. Clara, at 15, read the letters with the focused attention she brought to all text, and then announced that Montana was a state she intended to see, and then went back to her coursework from the Cheyenne teacher. And Birdie looked at Andrew, and Andrew looked back at Birdie with the mutual understanding of 2 people who have gotten approximately what they bargained for, and are not the least bit sorry about it. Henry, at 8, took Thomas's departure with the equanimity of a youngest child, who has already understood that the world expands and contracts, and that the important things come back, and threw his energies into following Andrew through the ranch work with an increased intensity that Frank said made the boy more useful than half the adults he had worked with, which Frank said without elaboration, because that was Frank's way, and the elaboration was unnecessary. The spring of 1905 brought Thomas home from Montana for the summer, broader in the shoulder and quieter in the way that people get quiet when they have been living independently, and have learned through experience what things cost. He had a manner about him now that was settled and specific, and he brought with him a girl he had been corresponding with, the daughter of the Montana horse outfit owner, a direct and capable young woman of 19 named Ruth, who shook Birdie's hand with a firm grip and looked at the ranch with an assessing eye that Birdie recognized as the eye of someone who was evaluating a place to commit to. She told Andrew that night that Thomas was going to marry Ruth within the year, and Andrew said he had noticed the same thing, and was it not something how that worked, and Birdie said yes, it certainly was something. They were married the following spring, in 1906, in the same church in Buffalo where Andrew and Birdie had been married 22 years before. Ruth Turner, which was not her birth name but became her name the day Thomas Archer married her, was exactly what the family needed and what Thomas had known to look for, though he could not have articulated that knowledge at the time, having simply followed a more intuitive navigation. At the wedding, Birdie stood with Andrew and watched their son marry a good person, and Andrew's hand found hers the way it had been finding hers for 21 years, without looking, without effort, as naturally as breathing. "We did all right," she said, very quietly, using the words she had used on the September porch with the apple basket years before. He squeezed her hand. "Considerably better than all right," he said back, as he always did. The church was full of the people they had built their years with, Cal and Ellen Whitmore, older now but still present and still sharp, Frank and Earl, the lending library women who had become her particular community, the pastor who had baptized all 3 of their children, the lawyer Whitfield's widow, the people of a life accumulated in a specific place over a long time. Clara was 19 at Thomas's wedding and about to leave for Cheyenne, where she had secured a position as a teacher's assistant through the correspondence she had been maintaining for 4 years, a first step toward the larger world she had always been heading for. She was not sad about leaving. She was, as she expressed it to Birdie with characteristic directness, extremely ready. She had, she said, read everything available in Johnson County and needed a wider selection. Birdie held her daughter on the morning she left, and Clara held her back with the specific concentrated fierceness of someone who loves deeply and also needs to go. And Birdie told her she was the smartest person she knew and to be careful on the road. And Clara told her that she knew she was smart and she was always careful and she would write twice a month, all of which she meant and all of which she did. Henry, at 13, waved his sister off from the porch and then went back to the fence he was mending with the philosophical acceptance of a boy who has always known his siblings to be people who went places, and who has also always known his own place to be here, on this land with these mountains, building towards something. Andrew watched Henry work the fence line that afternoon and came inside and said to Birdie, with no preamble, "He is going to stay." She looked up from her sewing. "I know. He loves this place the way I love this place," Andrew said. "He was born to it in a way the others were not." "Clara was born to the world," Birdie said. "Thomas was born to horses. Henry was born to this valley. And you were born to making sense of everything," Andrew said. She gave him the look. He gave her the smile. She set down her sewing. "Come here," she said. He crossed to where she was sitting and she took his hand and held it between both of hers. "Tell me something I do not know," she said. It was something she had been saying to him for years, whenever the evenings got quiet enough for honest accounting. He thought about it. He always thought about it properly. "I think about Caldwell sometimes," he said, "about the boy I was. I think that boy had the right idea and the wrong timeline and not quite enough courage, and that everything that came after, including the parts that were hard, was the consequence of that and also the remedy for it." He looked at her. "And I think if I went back to that stagecoach and told him what was waiting for him, he would not believe me. And I am glad I cannot, because he needed to earn his way to this." She looked at him for a long moment. "I would tell that girl at the gate one thing," she said. "I would tell her that the horizon is not a wall, that is all." He looked at her with everything that 21 years of mornings and evenings and seasons and children and hard work and complete love had put in his face. "That is a very good thing to know," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She held his hand, and outside the Wyoming evening was coming in its slow, magnificent way, the light going from gold to copper to the deep rose that preceded the dark, and the mountains were doing what they always did, which was to remain, and the river was doing what it always did, which was to run. And in this house on the Powder River that Andrew Archer had built with good timber and the intention of lasting, the two of them sat together in the ordinary grace of a life that had been. Across all its distances and all its years, one continuous act of choosing each other. The next morning came as mornings do, early and cold and entirely itself, and Andrew rose before light in the way he had always risen, and Birdie lay in the cedar-scented dark for the few minutes of his waking that she had been collecting since 1883. And then she rose and went downstairs and started the coffee, and the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and Henry could be heard moving in his room upstairs, and the horses in the pasture below the house were beginning their morning communications. And somewhere out in the world, Thomas was waking up next to Ruth, and Clara was waking up in Cheyenne with a room full of books. And it was morning in Wyoming, 1907, and the story of Birdie and Andrew Archer was not a story about goodbyes. It had started with one. It had survived two. The third one had been swallowed before it formed, dissolved back into the certainty of return, and what remained in its place was everything they had built in the absence of it, this life, this house, these children, this love that had grown from the soil of patience and loss and stubbornness, and the complete unwillingness of two people to accept that they were meant to remain apart. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She heard his boot on the stairs. She was standing at the window looking out at the Powder River when he came into the kitchen, and she did not turn around because she did not need to. Knowing him the way she knew the sound of the river and the direction of the wind and the names of all the stars visible from the loft window, by heart and by long attention. She heard him cross to her and felt his hand on her shoulder and lean back into him the way she had been leaning back into him for 22 years, and they stood at the window together and watched the morning come over the mountains and over the valley and over the river, watched it arrive the way it always did, unhurried and sufficient, lighting everything it touched. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and the day began.